Shana Tova. Everyone's got their last big marker of what we call, in our family, the before times. And mine is chaperoning the CRC ninth graders on their class trip to DC with Daniel and Maxine, while my parents drove in town to watch our children. Along with their luggage and gifts for my kiddos, they also brought the last boxes they had in their house of all the junk from my childhood. They'd been cleaning out their attic, and as a result, over their past few visits, had been bringing me the boxed up contents of my childhood bedroom. This trip brought the last of 9 boxes that I had stashed in my basement, we don't have an attic, to go through when I had time. And then the pandemic hit, and there were all these boxes waiting for me. I have to say, it was a crazy trip down memory lane unpacking those boxes. I found my cast from when I broke my arm in 3rd grade, my beloved Walkman still holding my even more beloved Whitney Houston tape, a box of cards my parents and grandparents had snail mailed me over 7 summers of sleepaway camp. And then, at the bottom of one of the boxes, I found a memorial service for, well, what I've discovered is that I don't even know how to describe her really. In some ways, she was my adopted grandmother. She took care of me and my brother almost every day after school and stayed with us when my parents went out of town. This is how I like to think of her. The way she would hug me when I came home from a hard day at school, and all the little ways she raised me to be the person I am today. She was also the longtime housekeeper for my family, who began working for my grandmother in 1947. She was a 16-year-old black girl in Memphis, whose best option in life was to go knocking on doors in a white neighborhood to see if someone would hire her. And so because of that, she was there every day after school, raising my dad and his brothers, just like she was with me and my brother a generation later. Her name was Bessie, Bessie Lawrence Smith. So, back to the boxes in my basement. I opened up the memorial booklet, started crying just a little bit, and began to read through it. And there, waiting for me, was Bessie's life story, a whole human life, somehow compacted into a single page. She was born in 1931 in Coldwater, Mississippi, it said, and she could light up the room with her smile. That I can attest to. And then next up was this line. Mrs. Smith was employed by the Kriger family for 70 years. She was committed to her longtime employer. I paused for a moment and I held the book out in front of me. Employer, employer, employer. Of course, my family had been her employer. Of course that was the word. But until that very moment, I never thought of Bessie as anything other than my family. As I sadly set Bessie's memorial booklet down, I was left with a lingering feeling of, why didn't my parents just leave this box buried deep in the back of their attic? So, speaking of things that have been tucked away, there's this crazy story from the Talmud that I want to take out from the proverbial corners of the attic of Jewish texts. It's a story with 3 characters. First, there's Rabbi Meir, who lived in the 2nd century CE. It's hard to overstate just how important he is to what Judaism has become. So much of the early foundational parts of Judaism that we take for granted were in part constructed by him, and his decisions reverberate through to us today. So that's our first character, Rabbi Meir. Next, there's his wife, Bruriah. She's one of the few women directly quoted in the Talmud. Her bright mind and sharp wit come through in the stories of the Talmud that remain about her. And in her time, she was greatly admired by her community for her knowledge of Jewish law. So greatly admired, in fact, that it's possible her husband found her hunger for knowledge more than a little threatening. And finally, there's a student. He doesn't have a name, but is constantly visiting Meir and Bruriah's home, one of the many coming to study and learn at the feet of Rabbi Meir. Okay, those are the characters, so here's the story. It starts with Berea, and it starts with her mocking the sages and students who came to her house and would routinely say misogynistic things like, women are lightheaded, they are weak-willed. But her mockery doesn't sit well with her husband, who immediately responded, by your life in the end you will know that this is true. And so Rabbi Meir came up with a gross test of his wife's will. He asked one of his students, the third person in our story, to test his wife's fidelity. We don't get all the details, but we are told that the student pushed and pushed over many days and months until Berea finally succumbed to his pressure. And it is then, after all this has happened, that she finally realizes what has transpired, what her husband has done. And so the story says, she took her own life. And Rabbi Meir, he fled to Babylonia because of the enormity of his shame. So what are we supposed to do with this indictment of Rabbi Meir, one of the great founding fathers of rabbinic Judaism? My first instinct was to hide this story away. That yuck feeling in my stomach screams pretty loudly with this one. And my guess is that's how the medieval rabbis felt when they came across it, because at some point it actually was removed from the Talmud, totally erased from the core text. We wouldn't even know about it, except it was preserved by a remark by Rashi, an 11th century commentator from France. He called it the Berea incident, and only gives us the bare outline of the story, as if it was one of those whispered secrets that everybody already knows. I was stunned when I came across the tale. Rabbi Meir was always presented as one of the good ones, one of the heroes. I get why the Talmudic rabbis didn't want the story to be passed on. But then there's the real hero of the story, Rashi, who somewhere deep down inside knew this story needed to be preserved. He knew there needed to be a footnote, a marker, a reminder that we can't shy away from those pieces of ourselves or our past that are difficult, painful, and fill us with shame. Rashi left this story here, knowing that at some point we all must face the things that we not only wish others would forget about us, but that we wish we could forget about ourselves. But the truth is, as much as we try to erase them, as much as we would like to remove them entirely from our story, they are always there, boxed up in the attics of our minds, waiting for us to clean them out. It took me a few days before I could put Bessie's memorial service and the rest of the contents of the boxes away in my basement. I couldn't stop turning it over and over in my head. It was a constant refrain. How is it possible that my relationship with Bessie, all the love and admiration I felt for her, was summed up in her obituary with the word employer? Even long after I had left home to go to college, married Daniel, and had children of my own, I always made a point of seeing her when I was visiting Memphis. I wanted her to know my children. For me, she was the link that connected the generations of my family. She knew my great-grandparents, people I'd never even met. And she knew my children, 5 generations of my family. Employer. I'd always imagined in 1947, when Bessie came to work for my grandma, that somehow it was meant to be, that she was meant to come into my family's life, that somehow our lives were destined to be intertwined. But the hard truth is, that's the romanticized version of the story I've told myself over and over again. The version I've wanted to tell myself. The version that makes it sound like Bessie wasn't dependent on us for her economic security. The version that says Bessie wanted to spend her time raising children that weren't her own, while her own 6 children spent long days without their mom. That says she cooked the best sweet potato pie with marshmallows for our Thanksgiving dinner table, not pausing to think about how she would be spending the holiday. That was the version of the story that I got to conveniently through the eyes of my beloved childhood Carrie. That was the version that got to ignore the fact that all of this, the entire dynamic, was because whether it was 1947 or 1986 or 2018, my family was white in America and Bessie was Black. Employer. It's a word that I needed to reckon with, to hear and say and read, to reach deep down into my own attic and draw out and wrestle with. Employer. My family was her employer. She was a 16-year-old Black girl born in Mississippi who moved to Memphis, looking for a way to make a life in a racist, misogynistic America. She had been robbed of an education, and so she set out going door to door in a white neighborhood, looking for a job. I don't know how many doors Bessie knocked on before my grandmother answered. What resilience and fortitude she must have had deep down inside her to knock on the doors of white strangers. My family had been her employers. When she had her kids and needed leave, when she needed to take time off to be with a sick family member, when she wanted to take a vacation, employer. I haven't wanted to face this part of Bessie's story because it hurts. Because I want to hold onto the Bessie of my childhood memories and not reckon with the racism infused into every part of the story. But the truth is, I'm doing her a disservice by pushing her realities and the realities of race deeper into my attic and shying away from them, instead of dragging them out into the light. For better or for worse, we don't have our own personal Rashi, footnoting and forcing us to reckon with the painful parts of our lives. That's what Yom Kippur is for, to remind us that the gates are not yet closed, to force us to do the difficult work we've already put off for yet another year, to demand that we search the corners of our attics and unpack the boxes we've ignored, collecting dust. I wish I could thank Bessie for all the sacrifices she made. Tell her that I know it wasn't easy knocking on doors at such a young age, or raising a family of her own while also taking care of us, or getting up every morning to take a bus to our house to go to work. I can't thank her vocally, but I can through my actions, how I tell the story of her life, how I teach my children about race, how I fight with my vote and voice for a more just and fair country. And so I invite all of us to do this, to take this moment to unpack those boxes that have been sitting in our own attics for far too long, to deconstruct and push deeper into those memories that we've romanticized, and to pay attention when our conscience pings us that there's more to the story than we are facing. Gemar Chatima Tova. May this be a year of growth, good health, and peace for us all.